Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 81. The Pequod Meets the Virgin. The fated day arrived, and we met the ship Jungfrau, commanded by Derek de Deer from Bremen. Once, the Dutch and Germans were the greatest whaling nations in the world, but now they are among the least. However, every now and then, you still see their flag in the Pacific, scattered across vast distances. For some reason, the Jungfrau seemed especially eager to greet us. Even while still far from the Pequod, she turned toward us and lowered a boat. Her captain, instead of standing at the stern, was impatiently standing at the bow as he approached. "What's that in his hand?" cried Starbuck, pointing to something the German was waving. "Impossible. A lamp filler?" "No," said Stubb. "It's a coffee pot, Mr. Starbuck. He's coming to make us coffee, isn't he? Don't you see that big tin can next to him? That's for boiling water. Oh, he's all set. The German is." "Get out of here," shouted Flask. "It's a lamp filler and an oil can. He's out of oil and has come to beg for some." It may seem strange for an oil ship to be begging for oil in the whaling grounds, and it certainly goes against the old saying about carrying coals to Newcastle, but sometimes it happens. In this case, Captain Derek de Deer definitely had a lamp filler, just as Flask had guessed. As he stepped onto the deck, Ahab confronted him directly, paying no attention to what he held in his hand. The German, in broken English, made it clear he knew nothing about the white whale and quickly shifted the conversation to his lamp filler and oil can. He explained how he had to sleep in total darkness because he had run out of oil from Bremen, and not a single flying fish had been caught to make up for it. He also hinted that his ship was what whalers call a clean one, meaning empty, which suited its name Jungfrau, or Virgin. Once his needs were met, Derek left. But before he had even reached his ship's side, whales were spotted from the mastheads of both vessels. Eager for the hunt, Derek didn't even pause to put away his oil can and lamp filler. He turned his boat around immediately and went after the whales. The whales had surfaced downwind, and since Derek and his 3 other German boats were closer, they had a head start on the Pequod. There were 8 whales in total, swimming side by side, rubbing against each other like horses harnessed together. They moved at great speed, leaving a wide wake behind them, as if they were unrolling a huge sheet of parchment across the sea. Trailing behind them by several fathoms was an old, large bull whale. He swam more slowly than the others and was covered in a strange yellow crust, suggesting he was either sick with jaundice or suffering from some other illness. It was unclear whether he belonged to the group ahead, as such old whales are usually solitary. Yet he followed their wake, though the current created by the faster pod seemed to slow him down. His blowhole spouted short, slow bursts of water, and each spout came with a choking sound, followed by strange internal rumblings that caused bubbles to rise in the water behind him. "Someone get him some medicine," said Stubb. "Looks like he's got a stomachache. Imagine having a stomachache that big. He's full of foul winds blowing out from the wrong end. But look, have you ever seen a whale wobble like that? He must have lost his rudder." Like an overloaded ship rocking through a storm, this old whale swayed and rolled as he moved. Now and then he would tip over slightly, revealing the stump of his missing right fin. Whether he lost it in a battle or was born without it, who knows? "Hold on, old fellow. I'll give you a sling for that wounded arm," mocked Flask, pointing to the nearby whale line. "Watch out, or he'll sling you instead," warned Starbuck. "Row faster, or the German will catch him first." All the rival boats set their sights on this one whale, not only because he was the biggest and therefore the most valuable, but also because he was the closest, while the others were moving so fast they were almost impossible to chase. By this point, the Pequod's boats had overtaken 3 of the German boats, but Derek's boat, having had a good head start, still led the chase. Every second, though, his rivals were closing in. The only concern now was that Derek might reach the whale first and throw his harpoon before anyone else could catch up. Derek seemed confident, even waving his lamp filler mockingly at the other boats. "The ungrateful dog," cried Starbuck. "He dares mock us with the very thing we just gave him. Pull harder, men. Faster." "Listen, men," shouted Stubb to his crew. "I don't like to get angry, but I could eat that wretched German. Pull harder. Are you going to let him win? Do you want brandy? A whole barrel of brandy to the best man. Come on, why aren't you bursting blood vessels yet? Is someone dragging an anchor? We're not moving. Look at that German. Will you spit fire or not? Look at all the foam he's making, yelled Flask, hopping around. What a hump! Come on, guys, move it. He's worth 100 barrels of oil. Don't lose him now. Don't let the German get him. There's $3,000 swimming away from us. A fortune. Just then, Derek started throwing his lamp filler and oil can at the advancing boats, maybe trying to slow them down or give himself an extra push forward with the toss. "The rude Dutchman," shouted Stubb. "Pull, men, like your lives depend on it. Tashtego, are you ready to break your spine for the honor of Gayhead?" "I say pull like hell," replied Tashtego. Spurred on by the Germans' taunts, the 3 Pequod boats began to catch up, rowing almost side by side. Standing tall at the bow, the 3 mates urged their crews onward, occasionally cheering them on with cries of, "There she goes! Hurrah for the chase! Beat the German! Sail over him!" Despite all their effort, Derek's head start would have ensured his victory, if not for a twist of fate. One of his rowers got his oar caught in a crab, causing the boat to nearly tip over. While Derek shouted angrily at his crew, Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask seized the moment, speeding past him. In no time, all 4 boats were in the whale's immediate wake, surrounded by the foaming water stirred up by the great beast. It was a terrifying, pitiful, and maddening sight. The whale was now moving headfirst, continuously spraying its spout in a tormented stream, while its one remaining fin slapped its side in pure panic. It swayed from side to side, faltering as it fled, and with every wave it broke through, it sank into the sea or rolled to the side, lifting its one flailing fin towards the sky. I've seen birds with clipped wings make terrified broken circles in the air, desperately trying to escape predatory hawks. But the bird has a voice to cry out its fear, while this vast, silent sea creature had none. Its terror was trapped inside, expressed only through the choking breaths from its blowhole, making the sight unbearably tragic. Yet, despite its size, massive jaws, and powerful tail, its very presence was enough to strike fear into anyone watching. The crew on the Pequod's boats were just moments away from having the upper hand, but rather than losing his prize, Derek decided to take a risky, long-distance shot. As soon as his harpooner stood up to strike, the 3 hunters, Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dagu, instinctively leapt up in a row, aimed their harpoons, and threw them simultaneously. Their 3 Nantucket harpoons struck the whale, knocking Derek's boat aside with such force that he and his harpooner were thrown into the sea. "Don't worry, my butterboxes," Stubb called to them as he sped by. "You'll get picked up soon enough. I saw some sharks behind us, just like St. Bernard dogs. They'll help distressed travelers. Hurrah! This is how we sail now. Each keel a sunbeam. Hurrah! This reminds me of hooking an elephant in a carriage. Makes the wheels spin, boys, and there's a chance of getting thrown off when you hit a bump. Hurrah! This is what it feels like to head straight for Davy Jones. Locker, all a rush down an endless slope. This whale's carrying the eternal mail." But the whale's run didn't last long. With a sudden gasp, it dived deep into the sea. The 3 lines whipped around the boat's posts so quickly that they carved deep grooves into them. The harpooners, worried that the lines would run out, struggled to secure them as the whale pulled the boats down, leaving their bows almost submerged while their sterns tilted up. The whale soon stopped its dive, but they held on, not daring to waste more line. This tension, the sharp harpoons embedded in the whale's back, often forces the creature to resurface in agony, only to meet its attackers' sharp lances once more. As they waited on the still sea, watching its blue depths, no sound or ripple came from below. It was hard to believe that beneath that calm surface, the largest creature of the seas was thrashing in pain. The ropes connecting the whale to the boats were thin, barely visible, like the strings holding a massive weight in place, yet the great Leviathan hung there, tethered to mere planks of wood. Was this the same creature once said to be invincible, one that laughed at spears and regarded iron as straw? As the boats hovered there in the afternoon light, their shadows stretched long across the water. Starbuck suddenly called out, "Stand by, men! He's moving!" The lines vibrated, sending the whale's life and death struggles up through the boats as if they were connected by electric wires. Just then, the boats bounced upward as the strain on the ropes was relieved. "Haul in! Haul in!" Starbuck shouted. The whale was rising. The lines that moments ago couldn't be moved were quickly pulled back, dripping wet. Within moments, the whale broke the surface just 2 ships' lengths away. It was clear that the whale was exhausted. Most land animals have valves in their veins that slow bleeding when injured, but whales don't. When harpooned, their blood flows freely, and the pressure of the deep ocean makes it even worse. Despite the whale's immense size, it had bled continuously, but still it was so massive that the blood had flowed for a long time. Now, as the boats closed in, lances were driven into it, and blood spurted from fresh wounds. Despite its suffering, the whale's spout hole, normally full of water vapor, was now only sending bursts of bloodless spray. As the boats got closer, much of the whale that usually remained underwater was now visible. Its eyes, or where they had once been, were horrifying to see, bulging, blind masses. But there was no pity for this aged, one-armed, and blind creature. It had to die so that people could light their weddings and churches. Even as it thrashed in its blood, a strange, discolored lump on its side was revealed. "That looks like a good spot," Flask shouted, aiming to strike. "Wait!" yelled Starbuck, but he was too late. The wound Flask caused sent a spray of infection out of the whale, pushing it into a final, desperate attack. It spouted thick blood and charged at the boats, flipping Flask's boat and splattering the others. It was the whale's last attempt at survival. By this time, it had lost so much blood that it helplessly rolled away, slowly turning over and revealing its white belly before dying. As the crews waited for the ship, they noticed the whale's body beginning to sink, still full of untapped oil. Starbuck quickly ordered lines to be tied to it so that all the boats were connected, holding the body just below the surface. When the ship arrived, they secured the whale with heavy chains, knowing that it would sink without support. Upon cutting into the whale, they found a rusted harpoon buried in its flesh, likely from a previous hunt. Even more astonishing was a stone lance head found embedded near the same spot, an ancient weapon from long before America's discovery. What other mysteries might have been hidden within the whale's massive body, no one could tell, as the ship was dragged dangerously to one side, threatening to capsize. Despite desperate attempts to break free from the sinking body, the tension was so great that the ship creaked and groaned under the strain. Finally, Pequod, using a hatchet, cut through the chains, and the whale sank. This sinking of freshly killed sperm whales is a curious phenomenon. Usually they float, but occasionally healthy young whales sink, much like this one did. In rare cases, the sunken whales rise again after gases form in their bodies, turning them into massive balloons. In places like New Zealand, whalers attach buoys to sinking whales so they can find them when they resurface. Not long after the whale sank, a cry came from the Pequod's masthead. The Jungfrau was lowering her boats again, chasing a finback whale, an uncapturable species known for its incredible speed. Yet, the Jungfrau sailed after it, disappearing in bold pursuit. There are many finbacks, and many whalers like Derek. Chapter 82. The honor and glory of whaling. Some tasks are best approached with a deliberate kind of disorder, as that can be the most effective method. The deeper I dive into the subject of whaling and trace its origins, the more I am struck by its great honor and long history. Especially when I discover that so many legendary figures, heroes and prophets of all kinds, have left their mark on it, I feel a sense of pride and belonging, even if only as a humble part, to such a distinguished brotherhood. Perseus, the brave son of Jupiter, was the first whaleman, and to the everlasting glory of our profession, let it be known that the first whale ever hunted by our group wasn't killed for profit. Those were the chivalrous days of whaling, when we bore weapons to rescue the helpless, not to fuel lamps. Everyone knows the story of Perseus and Andromeda, how the beautiful Andromeda, a king's daughter, was chained to a rock by the sea, and just as a sea monster was about to seize her, Perseus, the first and greatest whaleman, boldly stepped forward, harpooned the beast, and saved her, later marrying her. It was a remarkable achievement, rarely matched even by today's best harpooneers, because Perseus struck down the monster with a single blow. And don't doubt the truth of this ancient tale, for in the old city of Joppa, now called Jaffa, on the coast of Syria, There stood for centuries the enormous skeleton of a whale, which, according to the city's legends and its people, were the very bones of the monster that Perseus killed. When the Romans conquered Joppa, they took this skeleton to Italy in triumph. What's most intriguing about this story is that it was from Joppa that Jonah sailed. A similar adventure is that of St. George and the Dragon. Some even say it's derived from the story of Perseus. I believe that the dragon St. George fought was, in fact, a whale. In many old chronicles, whales and dragons are often mixed up, even used as stand-ins for one another. "You are like a lion in the waters and like a dragon in the sea," says the prophet Ezekiel, clearly referring to a whale. In fact, some Bible translations use the word whale. It would also lessen the grandeur of St. George's act if he had fought just a land reptile rather than a great sea creature. After all, anyone can kill a snake, but only a Perseus, a St. George, or a coffin would have the courage to face a whale. We shouldn't let modern depictions of the scene confuse us. Although the creature St. George fought is often shown as a griffin-like beast, and the battle takes place on land with St. George on horseback, we must remember that in those times, artists didn't know what a whale looked like. And, like in the case of Perseus, St. George's whale may have crawled onto the shore. The animal he rode might have been just a large seal or a seahorse. When we keep all this in mind, it becomes less strange to think that the dragon St. George killed was none other than the great Leviathan. In fact, when confronted with the hard truth, this whole tale is much like the story of the Philistine idol Dagon, who, when placed before the Ark of Israel, lost his head and hands, leaving only the fishy part of his body. In the same way, it becomes clear that one of our own noble profession, a whaleman, is the true protector of England. By this reasoning, we Nantucket harpooneers should be honored members of the Order of St. George. So let no knight of that order look down on a Nantucketer, for even in our rough woolen clothes and tarred trousers, we have more claim to St. George's honor than they do. As for Hercules, I wasn't sure whether to include him among us for a long time. According to Greek mythology, the mighty hero, like a pioneer of good deeds, was swallowed and then spat out by a whale. But does that alone make him a whaleman? The question is debatable. There's no evidence that he actually harpooned a whale unless he did so from the inside. Still, we might consider him an honorary whaleman, since the whale caught him if he didn't catch it. I claim him for our crew. But many conflicting accounts suggest that the Greek story of Hercules and the whale comes from the much older Hebrew story of Jonah and the whale, and possibly vice versa. Their stories are strikingly similar. So if I claim the demigod, why not the prophet too? Yet heroes, saints, demigods, and prophets aren't the only members of our ranks. Our true leader is still to be named. Just like the ancient kings of old, our fraternity traces its origins back to the gods themselves. Now let me tell you an awe-inspiring story from the ancient Indian scriptures, the Shastra, where the great god Vishnu, one of the three figures of the Hindu godhead, is said to be the master of the whale. When Brahma, the god of gods, decided to recreate the world after one of its cycles of destruction, he created Vishnu to oversee the task. But the sacred texts, the Vedas, which Vishnu needed to study before beginning creation, lay at the bottom of the ocean. So Vishnu took the form of a whale, dove to the deepest depths, and retrieved the sacred books. Isn't Vishnu a whaleman then? Just as someone who rides a horse is called a horseman? Perseus, St. George, Hercules, Jonah, and Vishnu. Now there's a member list for you. What other group can boast such legendary names as the Whalemans? Chapter 83. Jonah historically regarded. In the previous chapter, the story of Jonah and the whale was brought up. Now, some Nantucketers are a bit skeptical about this historical tale. But let's remember, even in ancient times, some skeptical Greeks and Romans doubted the stories of Hercules and the whale, or Arion and the dolphin. Still, their disbelief didn't make those legends any less true. One old whaleman from Sag Harbor had a specific reason for doubting the story of Jonah. He owned an old-fashioned Bible that had strange, inaccurate illustrations, including one showing Jonah's whale with 2 blowholes. This detail only applies to a specific type of whale, the right whale and others of that kind, which fishermen say has such a small throat that a penny roll could choke him. In response to this, Bishop Jebb had a thoughtful explanation. He suggested that Jonah didn't necessarily spend time in the whale's stomach, but might have been lodged temporarily in its mouth, which makes sense. After all, the mouth of a right whale could easily hold 2 card tables and seat all the players. Jonah could have even taken shelter in a hollow tooth. Except, of course, the right whale doesn't have any teeth. Sag Harbor had another reason for his disbelief, something about Jonah's body being affected by the whale's stomach acids. But this objection doesn't hold up either. A German scholar once suggested that Jonah might have taken refuge inside a dead whale floating on the sea. Much like French soldiers during the Russian campaign used the bodies of dead horses as makeshift shelters. Other commentators from Europe have speculated that when Jonah was thrown overboard, he may have swum to another nearby ship, perhaps one with a whale figurehead or even a ship named the Whale, much like ships today are called the Shark or the Eagle. Some scholars have even proposed that the whale in Jonah's story wasn't a literal creature, but instead a life preserver, a kind of inflated device that Jonah used to stay afloat and survive the ordeal. So, poor Sag Harbor seems to be proven wrong in every argument he made. But he had yet another reason for his doubt. As he remembered it, Jonah was swallowed by the whale in the Mediterranean Sea, and after 3 days was vomited out somewhere within 3 days' journey of Nineveh, a city on the Tigris River, far more than 3 days' journey from the closest point on the Mediterranean coast. How could that be? Well, was there any other way the whale could have delivered Jonah near Nineveh in such a short time? Sure, the whale might have carried him around the Cape of Good Hope, but even that explanation has issues, requiring Jonah to pass through the entire Mediterranean, then around Africa and into the Persian Gulf or Red Sea, all in just 3 days. Plus, the Tigris River near Nineveh is too shallow for a whale to swim in. Besides, if Jonah really did pass the Cape of Good Hope, that would mean he discovered it long before the Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz, contradicting recorded history. In the end, all of Sag Harbor's arguments just showed his foolish pride in his own reasoning, a pride that was even more inappropriate given his lack of formal education, aside from what he'd learned from the sun and the sea. His doubts reveal nothing but a stubborn, almost blasphemous rebellion against the teachings of the clergy. After all, a Portuguese Catholic priest had once proposed the very idea of Jonah traveling to Nineveh by way of the Cape of Good Hope as an impressive display of the overall miracle. And that makes sense. Besides, even today, the highly educated Turks still devoutly believe in the story of Jonah. About 3 centuries ago, an English traveler recorded in Harris's Voyages mentioned a Turkish mosque built in honor of Jonah, which contained a miraculous lamp that burned without oil. Chapter 84. Pitchpoling. To make carts move more smoothly and swiftly, people oil their axles, and for a similar reason, some whalers do the same to their boats. They grease the bottom. It's not hard to believe that while this might not cause any harm, it could actually be helpful. After all, oil and water don't mix. Oil is slippery, and the goal is to make the boat glide easily. Pequod believed strongly in greasing the boat, and one morning, not long after the German ship Jungfrau disappeared, he went above and beyond in doing so. He crawled under the boat, hanging over the side, and rubbed in the oil with great care, as if he was hoping to grow hair on the bare keel of the boat. It seemed like he was following some gut feeling, and it turned out he wasn't wrong. Around noon, whales were spotted, but as soon as the ship sailed toward them, they fled quickly and in chaos, much like Cleopatra's ships fleeing from the Battle of Actium. Despite this, the boats chased after them, and Stubbs' boat led the way. With great effort, Tashtego finally managed to hit one whale with a harpoon. But even after being struck, the whale didn't dive down. It just kept swimming fast and straight ahead, even picking up speed. The strain on the harpoon line was immense, and sooner or later, it was clear the harpoon would be pulled free. They needed to lance the whale while it was still on the run, or they would lose it. But catching up to the whale was impossible because it was swimming too fast and too wildly. What could they do? Of all the tricks and skills a seasoned whaler has to rely on, none is more impressive than the maneuver known as pitchpoling. Neither fencing nor any other sword technique can compare to this. It's only used with a whale that refuses to stop running. The key feature of this move is the incredible distance at which the long lance is thrown, accurately, from a violently rocking boat speeding through the water. The spear, including its steel tip and wooden shaft, is about 10 or 12 feet long. The shaft is thinner and lighter than a harpoon's, typically made of pine. A long rope called a warp is attached to it, so it can be pulled back after being thrown. Before going further, it's important to mention that while you can throw a harpoon in the same way as a lance, it's rarely done, and even less often is it successful. This is because the harpoon is heavier and shorter than the lance, which makes it harder to handle. As a general rule, you need to hook a whale with a harpoon first, before pitchpoling comes into play. Now, look at Stubb. His cool, steady humor in the most dangerous moments made him perfect for this skill. He stood upright in the tossing bow of the speeding boat, surrounded by foam, with the whale pulling them 40 feet ahead. Stubb handled the long lance with ease, checking it a couple of times to make sure it was perfectly straight. While whistling, he gathered up the coil of the warp in one hand, making sure the end was securely in his grip, and the rest of the line was free. Holding the lance in front of him, he aimed it at the whale, steadily lowering the handle in his hand, which raised the tip of the lance until it was perfectly balanced, 15 feet in the air. He looked like a juggler, balancing a long pole on his chin. In the next moment, with a swift, unexplainable motion, the shining steel flew in a high arc through the air and pierced the vital spot of the whale. The whale, which had been spraying water, now spouted red blood. "That popped the cork out of him," Stubb shouted. "It's the 4th of July. Let all fountains run with wine today. I wish it were Old Orleans whiskey, or some fine old Ohio or Monongahela. Then Tashtego, lad, you'd hold a cup to the stream and we'd all drink. Yes, indeed, we'd make a punch bowl out of his blowhole and drink right from it." Again and again, while Stubb kept up his playful talk, he threw the lance with precision. Like a greyhound returning to its master, the lance came back to him, ready to be thrown again. The whale, in agony, went into its final flurry. The tow line went slack, and Stubb, dropping back from the whale, folded his hands and silently watched the creature die. Chapter 85. The Fountain. For 6,000 years, and likely many millions of years before that, great whales have been spouting all over the ocean, misting and sprinkling the depths like so many watering cans. And for centuries, hunters have been right beside these fountains, watching the sprays and spouts. Yet, despite all this time and observation, even up to this very minute, 1:15 p.m. on December 16, 1851, we still don't know whether these spouts are actually water or just vapor. That's a pretty remarkable thing to consider. Let's take a closer look at this, along with some other interesting points. Everyone knows that fish, thanks to their special gills, breathe the air that's mixed in the water they swim in. A herring or a cod can live for 100 years and never once come up for air. But the whale, with its lungs similar to a human's, can only breathe air from the open atmosphere. That's why it has to come up to the surface regularly. However, it can't breathe through its mouth, which is typically buried at least 8 feet below the water's surface. Plus, its windpipe isn't even connected to its mouth. No, the whale breathes only through the blowhole on top of its head. If I say that breathing is essential to life because it pulls a vital element from the air, which then mixes with the blood to keep it alive, I wouldn't be wrong even if I sound a bit scientific. If we assume this, then it follows that if all the blood in a person could be oxygenated with just one breath, they could hold their breath for a while and still live. This is basically what happens with the whale. It can stay underwater for an hour or more without taking a single breath, because unlike fish, it doesn't have gills. So how does it do this? Well, between its ribs and along its spine, the whale has a complicated network of blood vessels that fill up with oxygen when it comes to the surface. This allows the whale to dive deep, carrying a reserve of oxygen, much like a camel stores water for crossing the desert. This anatomical fact is proven, and the reasoning based on it makes sense when you think about how insistent whales are about getting their spouts out, as whalemen say. Here's what I mean. If a whale is undisturbed when it comes to the surface, it will stay up for a set amount of time, taking a certain number of breaths, say 11 minutes and 70 spouts. It'll repeat this pattern every time it surfaces. If something startles the whale before it's done breathing, it will keep popping up again and again to finish its full allowance of breaths before diving deep again. Each whale has its own rhythm, but it's consistent for each individual. So, why does the whale insist on completing its spouts unless it's to refill its air supply before going back down? It's clear that this need to surface exposes the whale to danger during the hunt. For no hook or net could catch a whale when it's 1,000 fathoms deep. So it's not the skill of the hunter alone, but the whale's own needs that often lead to its capture. Humans breathe constantly, one breath for every 2 or 3 heartbeats. So no matter what else we're doing, awake or asleep, we must breathe or we'll die. But the sperm whale breathes only about 1/7 of the time. It's been said that the whale breathes only through its blowhole. If it were true that water mixes with the spout, we might also understand why the whale has no sense of smell. After all, the blowhole is the closest thing the whale has to a nose, and if it were clogged with water and air, it couldn't smell anything. But because of the mystery surrounding the spout, whether it's water or vapor, we can't say for sure. What we do know is that the sperm whale has no proper sense of smell. But what would it need that for? There are no roses or violets in the sea. Furthermore, since the whale's windpipe connects only to the spout canal, and that canal has mechanisms like locks on a canal to control the air and water, the whale has no voice. Unless we want to say that the strange rumbling sounds it makes are a form of talking through its nose. But really, what does the whale need to say? Profound creatures rarely have much to say to the world unless they're forced to speak. And luckily, the world is a good listener. Now, the whale's spout canal, designed mainly to carry air, runs horizontally just beneath the top of its head, like a gas pipe laid along one side of a street. So, the question remains, is this gas pipe also a water pipe? In other words, is the whale's spout just the vapor of its exhaled breath, or is it mixed with water taken in through the mouth and expelled through the blowhole? The mouth does indirectly connect to the spout canal, but we can't prove that this is for expelling water. After all, the sperm whale feeds deep underwater, where it can't spout even if it wanted to. Also, if you closely watch the whale's spout when it's unbothered, you'll see that the timing of the spouts matches the whale's breathing patterns. But why argue about this? You've seen the whale spout. So what is it? Can't you tell the difference between water and air? My friend, it's not so simple. The plainest things are often the hardest to figure out. And when it comes to the whale spout, even if you stand right in it, you might still be unsure of what it actually is. The central part of the spout is hidden by the mist that surrounds it, and when you're close enough to see it, the whale is usually thrashing about in the water, creating so much chaos that it's hard to tell if the spout contains water. And if you think you see drops of water in the spout, how do you know they aren't just condensed vapor? Or maybe they're just drops that were lodged in the spout hole. Even when the whale is calmly swimming on the surface, it often carries a small pool of water on its head, like a rock cavity filled with rainwater. It's also not wise for a hunter to get too curious about the nature of the whale's spout. You can't get too close or fill a cup from it. Even brushing against the outer mist of the spout can cause your skin to sting. I've even heard of a man whose skin peeled off after getting too close to the spout. Among whalemen, the spout is considered poisonous, and they avoid it. I've also heard that if the spout gets in your eyes, it can blind you. So, the best thing for an investigator to do is leave the spout alone. Still, we can form a hypothesis. My guess is that the spout is just mist. And besides other reasons, I'm led to this conclusion because of the majesty and mystery of the sperm whale. He's a deep, profound creature, never found near the shore like other whales. I think that from the heads of all deep thinkers, whether Plato, Pyrrho, or even the devil, there rises a kind of steam while they're thinking. Once, while writing about eternity, I placed a mirror in front of me and saw a strange swirling mist over my head. Even the constant moisture of my hair when I'm deep in thought after drinking tea in a hot attic seems like evidence of this. How grand it is to imagine the whale solemnly gliding through the calm tropical sea, with a vaporous mist rising from his head as if from his deep thoughts. And sometimes you'll even see a rainbow in that mist, as though heaven itself is sealing his thoughts. Rainbows only form in vapor, after all. In the same way, flashes of divine intuition sometimes break through the fog of my doubts, and for that I thank God. We all have doubts, and some deny, but few have both doubts and intuitions. It's this balance of doubting the earthly and sensing the heavenly that makes a man view both with equal wonder. Chapter 86. The Tail. Other poets have sung about the soft eyes of the antelope and the beautiful feathers of the bird that never lands. But I celebrate something less heavenly, a tail. If you consider the largest sperm whale's tail, starting from where its body tapers to about the size of a man's waist, the top surface alone covers an area of at least 50 square feet. Its solid round base spreads out into two broad, firm, flat flukes, which gradually thin to less than an inch. Where the flukes meet, they slightly overlap before spreading apart like wings, leaving a wide space between them. No living creature has more elegantly defined curves than the crescent-shaped edges of these flukes. In a full-grown whale, the tail can stretch over 20 feet wide. The entire tail is a dense web of tightly woven tendons, but when cut into, it reveals three distinct layers. The top and bottom fibers run long and horizontal, while the middle layer is short and runs crosswise between the other two. This structure is key to the tail's immense power. For those familiar with ancient Roman walls, this middle layer is reminiscent of the thin layers of tiles between stones, which contribute to the wall's incredible strength. As if the tail's raw strength weren't enough, the whale's entire body is interwoven with muscles and fibers that run down from the loins into the flukes. These muscles blend into the flukes and add to their strength, concentrating the whale's immense power into its tail. If matter could be destroyed completely, this tail could be the thing to do it. Despite its strength, the tail moves with incredible grace, flowing with an ease that belies its power. In fact, the whale's motions are most beautiful because of its strength. True strength never diminishes beauty or harmony, it often enhances them. Strength adds magic to all things that are strikingly beautiful. Imagine taking away the tendons that seem ready to burst from a carved marble statue of Hercules. Its charm would vanish. As the devout Eckermann lifted the sheet from Goethe's lifeless body, he was awestruck by the man's massive chest, which seemed as grand as a Roman triumphal arch. Even when Michelangelo paints God the Father, notice how strong he is portrayed. And while the softer, more feminine depictions of Jesus may capture his teachings of submission and endurance, they lack any hint of strength. The whale's tail is so flexible that whether it's playing, serious, or angry, its movements are always graceful. No fairy's arm could surpass it. The whale's tail has 5 distinct motions. First, as a fin for swimming. Second, as a weapon in battle. Third, for sweeping. Fourth, for slapping the water. And fifth, for raising the flukes above the surface. First, because the whale's tail is horizontal, it moves differently from the tails of other sea creatures. It never wriggles. In both humans and fish, wriggling is a sign of weakness. For the whale, the tail is the sole means of movement. It coils forward under the body and then springs backward, giving the whale its powerful darting motion. The side fins are only for steering. Second, it's worth noting that while sperm whales fight each other with their heads and jaws, they primarily use their tails to attack humans. When striking a boat, the whale curves its flukes away and hits only with the recoil. If the blow is made in open air and lands, it's irresistible. No boat or human ribs can withstand it. Your only chance of survival is to dodge it. If the blow comes sideways through the water, the whaleboat's lightness and flexibility usually mean a few cracked boards, but nothing worse. These side blows are so common in whaling that they're considered minor incidents. Someone strips off their coat and patches the hole. Third, I can't prove it, but I believe the whale's sense of touch is centered in its tail. Its delicacy is comparable to an elephant's trunk, especially when it sweeps its flukes gently across the surface of the sea. If it feels even the slightest touch, like a sailor's whisker, that sailor is doomed. What tenderness in that first touch. If the tail had any grasping ability, I'd think of the elephant in Darminode's story, which used its trunk to offer flowers to maidens and gently caress them. It's a shame the whale doesn't have this ability. I've heard of an elephant using its trunk to remove a spear lodged in its body. Fourth, when you approach a whale in the open ocean, you might catch it in a playful mood, frolicking like a kitten. But even in play, its power is evident. The whale flirts its massive flukes into the air, then smacks the water with a thunderous crash that echoes for miles. You'd think a cannon had fired, and the mist from its blowhole might seem like smoke from the shot. Fifth, normally, the whale's flukes are hidden below the water's surface. But when it dives, it lifts its entire tail, along with 30 feet of its body, high into the air before plunging down. This sight, along with the whale's majestic breeches, is one of the grandest in all of nature. The tail, reaching up from the depths, seems to grasp for the heavens. I've seen it in dreams, like Satan thrusting his claw from the flames of hell. But how you interpret this depends on your mood. If you're feeling like Dante, you'll think of devils. If you're in an Isaiah mood, you'll see archangels. I once saw a pod of whales at sunrise, their tails raised in unison toward the sun, and it seemed to me like a grand act of worship. Ptolemy Philopator once said the African elephant was the most devout of creatures, and I felt the same about the whale. Ancient military elephants would greet the morning with their trunks raised in silence, as if in prayer. Though I've compared the whale's tail to the elephant's trunk, they are by no means equals. The mightiest elephant is no more to the whale than a terrier is to an elephant. The elephant's strongest blow would feel like a playful tap compared to the crushing force of the whale's flukes, which have tossed entire boats and crews into the air, much like an Indian juggler tosses his balls. While comparing the bulk of a whale to an elephant may seem absurd, there are some similarities, such as the spout. Elephants often suck up water or dust in their trunks, and then spray it, much like a whale does with its blowhole. The more I think about the whale's tail, the more I regret not being able to fully describe it. Sometimes its movements seem as if they would be more fitting for a human hand, but they remain mysterious. In large herds, the whale's gestures are so strange that I've heard hunters claim they resemble secret signals, as if the whales were communicating with the world. And there are other equally strange motions throughout the whale's body that even experienced whalers can't explain. No matter how much I try to understand the whale, I only scratch the surface. I don't truly know it, and I never will. If I can't fully understand its tail, how could I possibly comprehend its head? And how can I understand its face when it doesn't even have one? It seems to say, "You may see my back, my tail, but not my face." But even its back is a mystery to me. As for its face, well, it doesn't have one. Chapter 87. The Grand Armada. The long, narrow Malacca Peninsula stretches southeast from Burma, forming Asia's southernmost point. From there, a series of large islands, Sumatra, Java, Bali, and Timor, create a natural barrier connecting Asia with Australia, separating the vast Indian Ocean from the crowded islands of Southeast Asia. This barrier has gaps or straits like those of Sunda and Malacca, through which ships and whales pass. Ships bound for China from the west typically pass through the Sunda Strait into the China Seas. The Sunda Strait, a narrow waterway dividing Sumatra and Java, is flanked by the prominent green headland called Java Head. The strait resembles a grand central gate into a vast empire. Considering the immense wealth of spices, silk, jewels, gold, and ivory from the thousands of islands in this region, it seems fitting that this area is geographically designed to appear guarded from the eager Western world. However, unlike the fortifications guarding entrances to the Mediterranean or Baltic seas, the Sunda Strait lacks strongholds. Here, ships have passed freely for centuries, unbothered by demands to lower their sails, as is required in some parts of the world. Yet despite the lack of formal fortresses, the region isn't without peril. For centuries, Malay pirates have hidden among the small coves and islands of Sumatra, ambushing ships passing through the strait and demanding tribute at spear point. While European ships have curbed their attacks somewhat with forceful reprisals, pirates still occasionally board and plunder English and American vessels. As the Pequod neared these straits, Captain Ahab planned to pass through into the Java Sea, then sail north, hoping to find sperm whales around the Philippine Islands and later Japan for the prime whaling season. By doing so, the Pequod would cover nearly all the known sperm whale grounds before heading to the Pacific in pursuit of Moby Dick, whom Ahab hoped to confront there. But what about the crew? Would they stop for fresh supplies? No. Like the sun, which circles the earth without needing sustenance, Ahab had no plans to stop. Whalers are different from other ships that carry goods to foreign ports. They carry only themselves, their crew, and what they need for survival. The Pequod had a vast supply of water on board, pure Nantucket water, which the crew preferred over any fresh water they could find in places like Peru or India. Because of this, the Pequod could sail for years without stopping, her crew never setting foot on land or seeing anyone besides other sailors. As the Pequod drew near Java Head, an area known for being a rich hunting ground for sperm whales, the crew was on high alert. Even though the ship had come close to the lush, palm-covered cliffs of Java, and the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, no whales had yet been spotted. But just as they were about to enter the strait, the lookout cried out, and soon an awe-inspiring sight appeared. Due to the relentless hunting of sperm whales in recent years, these creatures, which once traveled in small groups, now often gathered in large herds. In some areas, you could sail for weeks without seeing a single whale, then suddenly encounter thousands. In this case, miles ahead of the Pequod, a great semicircle of whale spouts stretched across the horizon, resembling the chimneys of a large city seen from afar. The Pequod raced toward the whales, the harpooners readying their weapons, hoping to capture some of the massive creatures. But as they chased the whales through the Sunda Strait, the crew suddenly noticed something alarming. Another semicircle of vaporous shapes appeared behind them. Upon closer inspection, they realized it wasn't whales, but a group of Malay pirates, giving chase to the Pequod. Ahab, unfazed, ordered the crew to wet the sails to catch more wind. He seemed to find dark humor in the situation, as though the pirates were unknowingly pushing the Pequod faster toward its true goal, Moby Dick. As the ship sped through the strait, chased by both whales and pirates, Ahab's mind wrestled with his destiny. He was being driven toward revenge, and even these atheistical devils were helping him get there. Yet Ahab remained as unshaken as a storm-battered beach that cannot be washed away. Most of the crew, however, paid little attention to the pirates. Once the Pequod finally outran them and emerged from the strait into the open sea, the crew's focus shifted back to the whales, which had begun to slow down. As the wind died, the order was given to launch the whaleboats. But just as the boats were preparing to give chase, the whales, as if sensing danger, regrouped into tight formations and surged forward with renewed speed, their spouts rising like ranks of soldiers' bayonets. The chase continued, with the crew still hopeful that among the fleeing whales, Moby Dick himself might be lurking. We stripped down to our shirts and underwear and rushed to the white ash area. After several hours of pulling, we were about ready to give up the chase when we noticed a general commotion among the whales. They seemed to be under that strange confusion fishermen call being gallied. Instead of swimming steadily in their usual compact groups, they broke into a chaotic frenzy. Like King Porus's elephants in the battle with Alexander, they appeared to be panicking. They swam in vast, irregular circles, moving aimlessly and spraying short bursts of water that revealed their state of distress. Some of them were completely paralyzed, floating helplessly like damaged ships on the sea. If these massive creatures had been a flock of simple sheep being chased by a few fierce wolves, they couldn't have shown more fear. This occasional timidity is typical of almost all herd animals. Even in large groups, lion-maned buffaloes in the West have fled from a single horseman. Just look at people packed into a theater. At the slightest hint of fire, they rush for the exits, trampling each other in a chaotic scramble. So there's no reason to be surprised by the frightened whales before us. The madness of humans often surpasses that of any beast. Although many of the whales were moving violently, the herd as a whole didn't advance or retreat, but stayed in one place. As expected in such situations, the boats scattered, each heading for a lone whale on the edge of the group. In about 3 minutes, Queequeg threw his harpoon. The struck whale sprayed water in our faces and took off, pulling us along at breakneck speed straight into the heart of the herd. Such a move from a struck whale isn't unusual, and it's often anticipated, but it presents one of the more dangerous challenges in whaling. As the fast creature dragged us deeper into the frenzied group, we felt like we were leaving our cautious lives behind, existing only in a dizzying rush. As the whale plunged forward, trying to shake off the iron harpoon lodged in him, we tore through the water, surrounded by the crazed creatures thrashing around us. Our boat felt like a ship caught in a storm, trying to navigate through a chaotic maze of icebergs, unsure of when it might get trapped and crushed. But Queequeg was undaunted. He skillfully steered us away from one monster directly in our path, then veered away from another with its enormous flukes hovering overhead, while Starbuck stood at the front of the boat, lance in hand, ready to jab at any whale that got too close. The oarsmen weren't idle either. Their usual duties were mostly set aside. They focused on shouting warnings. "Out of the way, Commodore!" yelled one to a large whale that suddenly surfaced and threatened to swamp us. "Watch your tail!" shouted another to a whale close to our boat, which seemed to be splashing water around calmly. All whaleboats carry certain peculiar devices, originally invented by the Nantucket Indians, called drugs. They consist of two thick squares of wood fastened together at right angles. A long line is attached to the center of this block, with a loop on the other end that can be quickly fastened to a harpoon. This drug is primarily used on panicked whales because there are usually more whales nearby than you can chase at once. Sperm whales aren't encountered every day, so when you have the chance, you need to kill as many as you can. If you can't kill them all at once, you try to wound them so you can finish them off later. That's when the drug comes in handy. Our boat was equipped with 3 of them. The first 2 were successfully thrown, and we saw the whales stagger off, restrained by the immense resistance of the towing drug, as if they were criminals in chains. However, when we threw the 3rd one, the heavy block got caught under one of the seats, tearing it out and knocking one of the oarsmen down. Water poured in through the damaged boards, but we stuffed a couple of shirts and drawers into the holes to stop the leaks temporarily. It would have been nearly impossible to use the drugged harpoons if our whale hadn't slowed down. As we moved further away from the chaos, the pandemonium seemed to lessen. When the jerking harpoon finally came out and the towing whale vanished, we glided between 2 whales into the heart of the herd, as if we had slipped from a mountain torrent into a calm valley lake. Here, we could still hear the storms raging outside, but didn't feel them. The sea was smooth and calm in this central area, created by the moisture released by the whales during their quieter moments. Yes, we had entered that magical calm said to exist at the heart of every storm. In the distance, we could still see the chaos of the outer circles, with pods of whales circling rapidly, so close together that a daring circus rider could have easily balanced on their backs. Because of the dense crowd of whales surrounding us, there was no chance of escape. We had to wait for a break in the living wall that had enclosed us. Staying at the center of the lake, we were occasionally visited by smaller whales, the females and calves of this scattered group. Overall, the area occupied by the herd must have covered at least 2 or 3 square miles, though this estimate might be misleading. We could see spouts of water shooting up almost from the horizon. I mention this because it seemed as if the cows and calves were purposely locked up in this inner fold. The wide spread of the herd probably prevented them from understanding why everything had stopped. Or maybe, being so young and innocent, they just didn't know. Whatever the reason, these smaller whales that occasionally approached our still boat seemed incredibly fearless and confident, almost as if they were under some spell. Like playful household dogs, they came up to our boat, sniffing and nudging it. Queequeg patted their heads, and Starbuck scratched their backs with his lance, though he held back from stabbing them, fearing the consequences. But beneath the amazing world above the water, another strange world met our gaze as we looked over the side. Suspended in those underwater depths floated the nursing mothers of the whales, along with those that were so large they seemed about to become mothers. The lake, as I mentioned, was incredibly clear at considerable depths, And just like human infants can gaze away from the breast while nursing, seeming to lead two different lives at once, these young whales appeared to be looking up at us, but not really at us, as if we were just a piece of seaweed in their newborn vision. Floating on their sides, the mothers also seemed to be calmly observing us. One little infant, showing signs of being hardly a day old, measured about 14 feet in length and 6 feet in girth. He was a bit lively, though it seemed like his body was still getting used to the cramped position it had just left in the womb, where, curled up from head to tail, the unborn whale lies bent like a bow. The delicate side fins and flukes still had the crumpled appearance of a baby's ears fresh from a foreign land. "Line! Line!" shouted Queequeg, looking over the side. He's fast! He's fast! Who got him? Who struck?" "Two whales, one big, one little." "What's wrong with you, man?" called Starbuck. "Look here," said Queequeg, pointing down. Just like when a wounded whale, having pulled out hundreds of fathoms of rope, surfaces again after diving deep, showing the slack curling line rising toward the air, Starbuck now saw the long coils of the umbilical cord of Madame Leviathan, which still tethered the young whale to its mother. In the frantic turns of the chase, this natural line can sometimes get entangled with the harpoon line, trapping the young whale. We seem to discover some of the sea's most subtle secrets in this enchanted pond, witnessing young Leviathan romances in the depths. The sperm whale, like all other species of Leviathan, breeds at any time of year. After a gestation of about 9 months, it usually gives birth to one at a time, though there have been rare instances of twins. To accommodate this, the whale has 2 teats positioned on either side of the anus, though the teats themselves extend upwards. If these precious parts in a nursing whale are struck by a hunter's lance, the mother's milk and blood will turn the sea red for yards around. The milk is very sweet and rich. It has been tasted by humans and would probably pair well with strawberries. When they are overflowing with affection, whales greet each other with a gentle touch. So, while surrounded by circles of fear and chaos, these mysterious creatures at the center freely and fearlessly indulged in peaceful activities, enjoying moments of affection and joy. But even so, amid the chaotic storms of my own being, I still find calmness at my core. Even as heavy planets of unending sorrow revolve around me, I still bask in the eternal softness of joy deep down. Meanwhile, as we lay mesmerized, the occasional sudden frenzies in the distance showed the other boats still busy trying to drug the whales on the outskirts of the group, or possibly engaging in battle within the first circle, where there was more room and convenient escape routes. But the sight of the furious, drugged whales dashing wildly across the circles was nothing compared to what we finally witnessed. Sometimes, when trying to capture a particularly powerful and alert whale, hunters attempt to hamstring it by cutting its huge tail tendon. This is done with a short-handled cutting spade attached to a rope for retrieval. A whale wounded, as we later learned, in this way had broken free from the boat, dragging along half of the harpoon line. In its agony, it was now thrashing through the water like a desperate fighter, causing panic wherever it went. Though the whale's wound was agonizing and a terrifying sight, the unique horror it caused in the rest of the herd stemmed from something we couldn't initially see due to the distance. Eventually, we realized that through some unimaginable accident, this whale had become tangled in the harpoon line it was dragging, and it had also run off with the cutting spade embedded in it. While the free end of the rope attached to the cutting spade had caught in the coils of the harpoon line around its tail, the spade itself had come loose from its flesh. Driven mad with pain, it was now thrashing through the water, wildly swinging its tail and injuring its fellow whales. This horrifying sight seemed to snap the entire herd out of their stillness. First, the whales at the edge of our lake began to crowd and bump into one another as if stirred by distant waves. Then the lake itself began to gently swell. The underwater nurseries disappeared, and the whales in the central circles began to swim together in denser clusters. Yes, the long calm was coming to an end. Soon, a low rumbling sound was heard, and then, like massive blocks of ice breaking apart in the spring, the entire group of whales rushed toward the center, seemingly trying to pile up into one huge mass. Instantly, Starbuck and Queequeg switched places, with Starbuck taking the helm. Oars, oars, he urgently whispered, grabbing the helm. Grip your oars and brace yourselves. My God, men, be ready. Push him away, Queequeg, the whale there. Poke him, hit him. Stand up, stay standing. Pull, men, don't worry about their backs. Scrape them, scrape away. Our boat was almost jammed between two enormous black bodies, leaving a narrow gap between their long shapes. But with desperate effort, we finally shot into a temporary opening, then quickly paddled forward, constantly watching for another escape route. After many close calls, we finally slipped into what had just been one of the outer circles, now filled with erratic whales all rushing toward the center. This lucky escape cost Queequeg his hat. While he was standing in the bow to poke at the fleeing whales, a pair of broad flukes nearby tossed his hat clean off his head. As chaotic and disorderly as the scene now was, it quickly became what looked like a coordinated movement. After finally clumping together in one dense group, the whales resumed their swift flight. Further pursuit was pointless, but the boats lingered in their wake to pick up any drugged whales that might be left behind, as well as to secure one that Flask had killed and marked. The mark, known as a waif, is a pole with a flag carried by every boat. It is stuck upright into the floating body of a dead whale to mark its location and indicate prior ownership in case another ship comes near. The outcome of this pursuit illustrated the old saying in the whaling industry: the more whales, the fewer fish. Out of all the drugged whales, only one was captured. The rest managed to escape for now. But, as we'll see later, they were eventually taken by other ships, not the Pequod. Chapter 88, Schools and Schoolmasters. The previous chapter described a massive group of sperm whales and suggested possible reasons for their large gatherings. Although such large groups are sometimes encountered, it's clear that even today, smaller, separate groups of about 20 to 50 whales can be seen. These groups are known as schools. They usually fall into two categories: those made up mostly of females and those consisting solely of young, active males, often referred to as bulls. With the female schools, there's always a large male, but he's not old. When there's danger, he gallantly positions himself at the back to protect the females. This male is like a wealthy sultan, swimming through the ocean, surrounded by the comforts of his harem. The contrast between him and his females is striking. While he is a massive creature, the females, even when fully grown, weigh only about a third of an average male. They are relatively delicate, probably measuring no more than 6 feet around the waist. Still, it's undeniable that they are generally well fed. Watching this harem and its leader as they lazily drift is quite fascinating. Like fashionable folks, they are always on the move, seeking variety. You might see them around the equator during the peak feeding season, having just returned from spending the summer in northern waters, escaping the heat. After lounging along the equator for a while, they set off for the eastern waters, looking forward to the cooler temperatures there. When cruising on one of these journeys, if anything suspicious appears, the male keeps a watchful eye on his family. If a bold young male gets too close to one of the females, the bull will chase him away with great fury. It would be quite the scandal if unprincipled young males were allowed to intrude on domestic life. Yet, despite the bull's efforts, he can't keep the most notorious seducer from approaching, since all fish share the same waters. On land, females often provoke fierce rivalries among their suitors, and whales are no different, sometimes engaging in deadly battles over love. They clash with their lower jaws, sometimes locking them together as they vie for dominance, much like elk intertwining their antlers. Many whales bear deep scars from these encounters: rough heads, broken teeth, and torn fins. However, if a young male retreats at the bull's first charge, it's amusing to see how the bull subtly returns to the group, reveling in his proximity to the young male, much like a wise king among his concubines. When other whales are nearby, fishermen usually avoid pursuing the larger males, as these bulls are wasteful with their energy and therefore less valuable. As for their offspring, they are left to fend for themselves, with only the mothers to care for them. Unlike some other roaming lovers, the bull whale has no interest in nurturing his young, preferring instead to roam the seas, leaving his unnamed babies scattered around the world, each one a little exotic. Eventually, as the years pass and he becomes less youthful and more reflective, this once passionate male will grow tired and settle down, abandoning the harem. He becomes a solitary old soul, moving through the ocean while praying and warning young whales against their romantic mistakes. In the fishing world, the female harem of whales is called a school, and the male leader of that school is known as the schoolmaster. It's somewhat ironic that after attending school himself, he goes on to teach not what he learned, but rather the folly of it. The term schoolmaster seems to derive from the name of the harem, though some believe the person who coined the term might have been inspired by the memoirs of Vidocq, the famous Frenchman, and the sort of country schoolmaster he was in his youth, including the lessons he imparted to his students. The isolation and solitude the schoolmaster whale experiences in old age are common to all mature sperm whales. Almost universally, a solitary whale, or a lone leviathan, is an old one. Much like the venerable Daniel Boone, he prefers to be alone with nature, taking her as his only companion in the wilderness of the ocean, though she keeps many secrets. The schools of young, vigorous males mentioned earlier stand in stark contrast to the harem schools. While the females tend to be timid, the young males, referred to as 40-barrel bulls, are the most aggressive of all whales and notoriously dangerous to encounter, except for the remarkable old gray whales, which will fight fiercely if provoked. The 40-barrel bull schools are larger than the harem schools. They are full of energy and mischief, swimming wildly around the ocean at such a reckless pace that no cautious underwriter would insure them, much like a rowdy college student at Yale or Harvard. However, they soon settle down. By the time they are 3/4 grown, they break up and start searching for harems of their own. Another key difference between the male and female schools is even more indicative of their natures. If a 40-barrel bull is injured, his friends will abandon him. But if a female from the harem school is hurt, her companions will surround her, showing deep concern, often staying close for so long that they may become targets themselves. Chapter 89. Fast Fish and Loose Fish. The mention of waifs and waif poles in the previous chapter requires an explanation of the laws and regulations governing whaling, as the waif symbolizes the essence of these rules. When multiple ships are out hunting together, it often happens that one vessel strikes a whale, which then escapes, only to be killed and captured later by another ship. This scenario includes many smaller details, all related to this main point. For example, after a long and dangerous chase, a whale might become detached from a ship due to a severe storm. The whale could then drift far away and be caught by another whaler, who can easily tow it alongside without any danger. This could lead to significant disputes among fishermen if there weren't some universal laws, either written or unwritten, applicable to all situations. The only formal whaling code enacted by law was created in Holland in 1695 by the States General. While no other country has an official whaling law, American fishermen have established their own guidelines. Their rules are so concise and comprehensive that they surpass even the legal texts of Justinian and the regulations of the Chinese Society for the Suppression of Meddling with Others. In fact, these laws could fit on a small coin or a harpoon barb and be worn as a necklace due to their brevity. Number 1. A fast fish belongs to the party that is fastened to it. 2. A loose fish is fair game for anyone who can catch it first. However, the simplicity of this code creates confusion, as it leads to a need for extensive commentary to clarify its meaning. First, what is a fast fish? A fish is considered fast, whether alive or dead, if it is connected to an occupied ship or boat by any means controlled by its occupants. This could be a mast, an oar, a cable, or even a thread. A fish is also classified as fast if it carries a waif or another recognized symbol of possession, as long as the party claiming it shows they can retrieve it whenever they want. These definitions come from scientific commentary, but whalemen often use more direct and physical methods to resolve disputes. Essentially, they might settle things with a fight. Among the more honorable whalemen, there is usually understanding for unique situations where it would be unfair for one party to claim a whale that another party has previously hunted or killed. However, not all whalers are so scrupulous. About 50 years ago, there was a notable case in England involving a dispute over a whale. The plaintiffs claimed that after a hard chase in the northern seas, they had managed to harpoon the whale. However, they were forced to abandon their lines and boat due to the danger they faced. Later, the defendants, the crew of another ship, caught up with the whale, struck it, killed it, and claimed it right before the plaintiffs' eyes. When the plaintiffs protested, the defendants' captain arrogantly dismissed their concerns, stating he would keep the plaintiffs' lines, harpoons, and boat, which were still attached to the whale when he seized it. Consequently, the plaintiffs sued for the value of their whale, lines, harpoons, and boat. Mr. Erskine represented the defendants, while Lord Ellenborough presided over the case. During his defense, the clever Erskine compared his argument to a recent adultery case, in which a man, after failing to control his wife's infidelity, abandoned her. Years later, regretting his decision, he sought to reclaim her. Erskine argued that although the man had originally captured his wife, she had become a loose fish after he abandoned her. Therefore, when another man took her, she rightfully became his property, along with whatever harpoon remained lodged in her. Erskine contended that the cases of the whale and the woman were analogous. After hearing the arguments, the learned judge ruled that the plaintiffs would get their boat back because they had only abandoned it to save their lives. However, the contested whale, harpoons, and lines belonged to the defendants, as the whale was a loose fish when captured, and the fish had acquired ownership of the harpoons and lines during its escape. Thus, whoever captured the whale afterward was entitled to those items. Since the defendants caught the whale, they were entitled to all of it. A common person might question the judge's decision. However, if we dig down to the core of the matter, we see that the two main principles established in the whaling laws, regarding fast fish and loose fish, form the basis of all human law. Despite its complex structure, the law is supported by two fundamental principles. Isn't it commonly said that possession is 9/10 of the law? This means that it doesn't matter how something was acquired. In many cases, possession is everything. What are the rights of Russian serfs or American slaves but fast fish, where possession is the entire law? What is a landlord's claim to a widow's last coin but a fast fish? What is the mansion of a deceitful villain, marked with a door plate as a waif, but a fast fish? What about the excessive fees that the broker Mordecai extracts from poor Woebegone, the bankrupt, just to keep Woebegone's family from starving? Isn't that a fast fish? What about the Archbishop of Savesoul, whose income of £100,000 comes from the meager bread of countless laborers? Isn't that £100,000 a fast fish? What are the Duke of Dunder's inherited towns and villages but fast fish? What does John Bull, the famous harpooner, think of poor Ireland? Isn't that a fast fish? And to Brother Jonathan, the apostolic soldier, what is Texas but a fast fish? In all these cases, isn't possession the whole law? While the idea of fast fish is generally applicable, the concept of loose fish is even more universal. What was America in 1492 but a loose fish when Columbus planted the Spanish flag as a symbol of possession for his monarchs? What was Poland to the Tsar? What was Greece to the Turks? What is India to England? What will Mexico ultimately become to the United States? All are loose fish. What are the rights of man and the liberties of the world but loose fish? What about everyone's thoughts and opinions? Aren't they loose fish too? What is religious belief but a loose fish? What are the ideas of great thinkers to the pretentious, flashy speakers but loose fish? What is the entire planet itself but a loose fish? And what about you, dear reader? Are you not both a loose fish and a fast fish? Chapter 90. Heads or Tails. About whales, it is sufficient to say that the king gets the head and the queen the tail. Bracton, Book 3, Chapter 3. This Latin phrase from the laws of England means that of all whales caught off the coast, the king, as the honorary grand harpooner, is entitled to the head, while the queen should receive the tail. This division resembles splitting an apple in half. There's no part left over. This law, which is still in effect in England today in a modified form, presents a curious exception to the general rules concerning fast and loose fish. Thus, it is discussed in this separate chapter, much like how English railways often have a special car reserved for royalty. To demonstrate that this law is indeed still enforced, I will recount an incident from the past 2 years. A group of hardworking fishermen from Dover, Sandwich, or one of the Cinque Ports had, after a tough chase, succeeded in killing and beaching a fine whale they had spotted from the shore. The Cinque Ports fall under the jurisdiction of a kind of officer called the Lord Warden, who is appointed by the Crown. The Lord Warden receives all the royal benefits associated with the Cinque Port territories. Some writers call this position a sinecure, but that's not quite right. The Lord Warden is often busy collecting his perks, which he primarily gets because of his office. So, when these sunburned fishermen, barefoot and with their trousers rolled up, finally dragged their big catch onto the beach, looking forward to about 150 pounds from the valuable oil and bones, and dreaming of enjoying fine tea with their wives and good ale with their friends, a learned and charitable gentleman approached them, carrying a copy of Blackstone. He placed it on the whale's head and proclaimed, "Hands off! This fish is a fast fish. I claim it for the Lord Warden." The fishermen, taken aback and unsure of what to say, scratched their heads nervously while glancing between the whale and the stranger. But this didn't soften the heart of the learned gentleman with the copy of Blackstone. After a while, one of the fishermen gathered the courage to speak up. "Excuse me, sir, but who is the Lord Warden?" "The Duke," came the reply. "But the Duke had nothing to do with catching this fish. It belongs to him. We went through a lot of trouble, risked our lives, and spent money. Are we to receive nothing for our efforts except blisters? It belongs to him. Is the Duke so poor that he has to resort to this to make a living? It belongs to him. I wanted to use part of my share to help my sick mother. It belongs to him. Couldn't the Duke settle for a quarter or a half? It belongs to him." In short, the whale was taken, sold, and the Duke of Wellington received the money. Thinking that, in some ways, this might be considered unfair, a kind-hearted clergyman from the area wrote to the Duke, asking him to consider the plight of the unfortunate fishermen. The Duke's response, both letters were published, essentially stated that he had already taken this into account and received the money, and he would appreciate it if the clergyman would refrain from interfering in other people's affairs in the future. Is this the same old man who stands at the corners of the three kingdoms, demanding charity from beggars? It's clear that the Duke's claimed right to the whale comes from the sovereign, so we must ask on what grounds the sovereign holds that right. The law itself has been stated, but Plowden gives us the reasoning. The whale belongs to the king and queen because of its superior quality. Sound commentators have always accepted this argument, but why should the king get the head and the queen the tail? Lawyers explain that. In his work on Queen Gold or Queen's Pin Money, an old King's Bench author named William Prynne writes, "The tail belongs to the queen so that her wardrobe can be supplied with whalebone." This was written at a time when the flexible whalebone from Greenland or right whales was widely used in women's bodices. However, that bone is found in the head, not the tail, which is a mistake for a clever lawyer like Prynne. Is the queen a mermaid to be presented with a tail? Perhaps there's an allegorical meaning behind this. There are two royal fish recognized by English law, the whale and the sturgeon. Both are considered royal property under certain conditions and contribute 1/10 of the crown's ordinary revenue. I haven't seen other authors mention this, but it seems reasonable to infer that the sturgeon should be divided in the same way as the whale, with the king receiving the dense, elastic head of that fish, which might symbolically hint at some humorous connection. Thus, there appears to be a reason for everything, even in the law.